My full name is John Martin Prosser, okay, and I am mostly Celtic. I was born and raised in Wichita, Kansas. My father was an attorney there. He actually lived in Lawrence, Kansas, but my mother was from Wichita. And when he came out of law school, they settled in Wichita. When you're born in that era, you remember all the dust storms coming in. I mean, finally, in the late 30s, I'm old enough to remember those, and when everything just blanked out, and you had to literally go down and live in the basements areas in the houses, and they were all built very much like what new urbanism is all about. Which is not new urbanism, pardon me, but it isn't. So it was much cooler down there and all those things because it was miserably hot. And of course, all of the windows had to be shut. Otherwise, you just ended up with nothing but dust in the house, throughout the house. We lived a wonderful thing on what was really Main Street, USA. I mean, you had all the nice things. The bus stop was a half a block away, and I could ride my bicycle to the drugstore and back and all those good things. Had a great playground and park nearby. That's why I say it's all like you get on this, the whole thing with the new urbanism, and also in terms of the aspect of the Garden City. The other good fortune for me, which influenced a whole lot of things, is that because of the war and you couldn't go anywhere, I ended up learning how to play golf when I was 8 years old, and I've played the rest of my life until recently, about 5 years ago, when physically I just can't play anymore. Of course, Wichita was a rather extraordinary place because that was where they were manufacturing all the aircraft, or I should say a lot of the aircraft, of particularly Boeing produced the B-29 there. Everybody knew that it was coming out to be tested, so everybody drove out to see it being tested. Things like that, and then you had Beech and Cessna, and then finally Boeing produced the B-47, which was the first of the multi-engine, high-speed jet airplane bombers. And I can remember because it started coming out in 1947, and we would look at that airplane and just say, that's just absolutely amazing. And never in my wildest dreams would I have anticipated that I would end up being a combat pilot in that particular airplane. The Korean War started in 1950, and one was trying to say, well, I didn't really want to be on the ground as a foot soldier, so everybody joined the ROTC, and that was the Air Force ROTC. When you were at Kansas, you had to spend 2 summers working, either 2 in an office, or 1 summer working construction, or 1 summer working in an office in order to get your degree. I mean, that was mandatory. So I fortunately worked with a firm in Wichita, and they allowed me to work with them after I graduated, until I was then called in the following May. I started out just to go through that in San Antonio, where you do your induction for a month and go through all of that. And then I was sent to McAllen, Texas to do primary for 6 months, then to Lubbock, Texas to do multi-engine training. And the interesting thing about that, we were flying B-25s, which was a fascinating thing because we learned how to do short field takeoffs just like Doolittle did going into Japan. And then from there I was sent to Stead Air Force Base because everybody had to go through prisoner of war survival and escape and evasion training. And I was in the Strategic Air Command under General LeMay, and also the base commander was Paul Tibbets, who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. Then I was sent overseas on combat duty to Morocco. And that was interesting because that's when the Moroccan Civil War was going on. And that was my first experience of dealing with curfews and off-limit places that were barbed wire. And Casablanca is a magnificent French Baroque city, really quite extraordinary. And we were still even able, off duty, to go through the Casbah, and they had a huge Bedouin encampment outside the city, and you begin to start to look about other cultures. When I then applied for graduate school, and I narrowed it down to two schools, MIT, and that at that point was Carnegie Institute of Technology, CIT. They were intrigued because here was somebody coming out of the Air Force who had extensive training, and literally the Air Force had spent, well, they said about $250,000 per pilot in that days. That's $1950. So I had all that technology, so when I went back to go to school, I said I want to talk about, or learn more about history and philosophy and design. And I didn't want to go into any more in terms of the technical, because I'd been there and done that. And in the undergraduate, I had done some campus planning, and I had gotten involved just as extracurricular in theater on the campus, not doing design. But at Carnegie, I ended up, because it's one of the, well, arguably the finest undergraduate theater program in the country. And so I ended up doing theater design and campus planning there for my thesis. When I was here in my two great firms, in terms of the practice was Jim Sudler, who was very well trained at Princeton. And then Deb Carlson was my mentor academically, for whom I am forever grateful, because he was the one that hired me along with G.K. Vedder. The last major project I did for Jim Sudler, I was the project architect on the original Ponte Denver Art Museum. I had to put all of the transition from schematic into design development, all the details, everything I was responsible for because I was running that project. And that was wonderful because Ponte was absolutely extraordinary to work with. I mean, he was such a delight. And you have to keep in mind, in 1964, when we were doing the design work, you did have the jet airplane flying from Europe and from Paris or London to New York and Washington, D.C., but everything else was by reciprocal aircraft. And doing a long-distance telephone call was very tedious. No fax, no internet, none of that. So it took days to get any kind of things, and then here would come all of these postal rolls. And for example, the elevations for the Denver Art Museum were like a Chinese scroll. It was a great big roll of bumwad, and because there are 28 elevations on the Art Museum, and everything he was doing, he said, I'm doing it as a painting. You see, and everything is composed, and yes, there are all the corners, all those other corners, but everything was there, and then we had to make it fit from where you sat in the window, or where you stood and looked on something that was displayed closely, or where you stood in a full window, and then what were the widths, because it was, you had four choices. You could have the whole museum artificially lit, or semi. You could have it semi-naturally lit, or you could have it all naturally lit, like Mies would do in his museums, which are very impossible to use. And so with the head of the museum, Dr. Bach, he wanted the semi-artificial, because we had to open up all those windows so you would get those incredible views, because this is a 360-degree building. I started in 1966 with the university. Boulder. Oh yeah. No, there was nothing in Denver at that point. We went from the school into the College of Environmental Design in 1969, and we then made the outpost in Denver with Dwayne Newsom and Dan Schlayer in terms of urban design and planning, because they said the planners said they absolutely wanted the graduate program in Denver. And then the architecture program was to come down in phases, and we started, and I was the first director of the environmental design program, and we would add 1 year at a time and pull off 1 year at a time. And then finally, the first full class that started in Denver in architecture, if I remember correctly, was 1975. And among other people of distinguished note, Jennifer Moulton was in that class. Of all the things that are the most rewarding, doing that on the design review board for the university system, because there are 8 physical campuses, and probably there'll be a 9th since they're going to take over the management of Memorial Hospital. But in dealing with that from 1981 on, when Hideo Sasaki talked Arnie Weber saying the design review board should review all projects on all campuses, not just the Boulder campus. And see, Hideo had started there in 1962. He was hired by Quig Newton. But the neat thing was I got to work with Hideo for 20 years. And that was almost on a weekly basis of consulting, because there was so much happening on all the campuses. And there's just so much going on now. And we increased the board from 4 people to 5 people so that we could allocate the work out on an individual basis, because there's that liaison between one person and the selection, as well as each project, working with staff and with the various clients on each of the campuses. So I've been there now 32 years. And it's so gratifying because it's so positive and it affects so many people. We did a lot of really fine things, and probably the finest we did was doing the first design for what is now the Anschutz Fitzsimmons campus, because we did the whole thing in 1998, and then the groundbreaking was 2000. And since 2000, you might be intrigued to know that we have built 8.8 million square feet. And there are 20,000 people out there every day on a regular weekday. And there's almost $2 billion under construction right now, including the VA, the addition to Children's, the addition to Anschutz Hospital, the health and wellness, parking structures. I was in very good shape there, because I just said, well, I was still eligible for a sabbatical for 1 semester, and I just told him in 2002, because we went over there to live for 6 weeks just to have a fun time. That was in 2002, and I just called him and said, if you want a freebie, I'd be happy to come and teach. And they said, oh, that would be great, because we had set up in literally 2000, they set up the Urban Institute Ireland, which was a research wing to try to deal with their urbanization problems. And they have the same thing, urban design, landscape architecture and planning, and civil engineering in their school. So I said, that's wonderful, I'll teach fall semester. And then I would come back to Colorado and teach spring semester, as I was going through a phased retirement over 5 years. Again, the university is very generous on that. So I got to, for 2 years, work on the Dublin to Belfast, but then I was working with, for example, the Dublin Transportation Authority, and our traffic problems are nothing. I mean, they say Dublin is the worst traffic mess in all of the EU, among other things. The Irish drive more miles per capita than any country in the world by a factor of 30%. Got lots of crooked roads. We're second. They drive almost they drive over 24,000 kilometers a year per person. So I really got indoctrinated, and then I kept teaching And it's fun to watch that corridor develop because it is a coordination with both the north and the south. And all of that has died down for the most part. I mean, there's still some splinter groups that are trying to create all sorts of hell. But most of it now is completely open, and when we first got there, you still had guardhouses and barbed wire. You weren't going through checkpoints anymore, but they were still going through on the border towns with the shock troops, with their AK-47s, house to house, and you just kept going down Main Street as fast as you could. Overall, of course, the university as a total has been my career because I've been with them starting part-time and now still part-time for 46 years. And 40 years full-time.
And they've put up with you all this time?
They've put up with me all this time, and I have the great privilege of working for Bruce Benson. And he is one of the very best presidents I've worked with on the Design Review Board starting back in 1981. So by good fortune, I get to do a lot of front-end consulting all up and down. I've worked on, from scratch, on 2 cities in China. And then that one was fun because that one was really done sustainable, and that was done with what is the best way to do housing and all of the other aspects of any city without going into high-rise. Everything was based upon the Paris model, Geneva, Jerusalem, and Washington, D.C., which you have height limits, because we have found out it doesn't work for housing to go beyond 25 meters or 75 feet for normal housing, which is 50% of the people because they can't afford to buy a house. So we try to do things and push it, and that's why we're in such horrendous economic problems right now. I'll leave you with a wonderful Irish toast, okay? And it's one of those things because these are tough times. May you live as long as you want, and never want as long as you live.